All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to your cold and rainy Wednesday afternoon edition of herpetology class. Hopefully we'll be getting out in the field very soon, but today is not that day, at least if we're looking for reptiles. But we've got a lot to do in here and a lot of stuff that I'm kind of excited to work through as well. So today we're going to work on some data analysis. We're going to talk about some local snakes. And of course, you have quiz number 3, part of which is frog calls. So here, let's walk through our agenda for today. I'm going to just one more time announce some of those awards and prizes that you can apply for. And we're finally going to analyze our data from our in-class experiment. And then I'm going to do a very, very short lecture on talking about some native snake species that we can expect to see possibly along the Delaware run as early as Monday, I'm hoping. And then I'm just going to wrap things up, bless you. And then we'll do quiz number 3 right at the end. That way, when you're done with it, you can just be done with class and go off and do whatever it is you're going to do today, which is probably go listen for frog calls out in the wild. So before we dive into all of this, what questions do you have for me about what's going on right now? Ethan, go ahead. And then Abby, gotcha. I don't know how everybody else feels. Will we possibly do the quiz first? No, it's not. Sorry. Because I arranged it this way so that I could take it, it would work in coordination with people that took it at the testing center, and I already coordinated some of that. And so normally I do give quizzes first, but in this case, I'm trying something different due to feedback from students trying to accommodate everybody. Sorry, Abby. That's correct. We'll do the frog calls together. And then once we do those, then you'll have the rest of the quiz, and then everyone, you work independently on that. Yep, just to be clear. And we should be done with the frog calls by about 2:30 is what I said, or excuse me, not 3:30 if people scheduled it for the testing center. Yes, Sam.
Our final draft for our primary literature, that's still on Friday, right?
Correct. And that there's a reminder of this in your class program, but that final, the revised draft of your primary lit summary based on your feedback from the workshop on Monday is due by Friday. You don't need to submit anything new. I already have the link because you already sent me the link with your initial submission. I'll just assume that after Friday, you've revised it and I'll start grading them. Chloe, go ahead.
Program says revision due before class Monday.
The program does? No, for the primary lit assignment?
Yeah, it says primary literature assignment number 2 workshop reflection revision due before class Monday, 11 April.
Which class program are you looking at?
The 6th. Today.
Did one for today?
Yes.
Okay.
That's why I emailed you.
Okay. I thought I said the 8th, but I guess I didn't. So sure, yeah, the Monday's fine then. Yeah, Monday's fine. I'll just assume it's that's fine. Athena, question. Yeah, cool. Yeah, sorry for that. I think what I did is I made some materials with the due date and then I changed my mind. But it's fine. Monday's fine. That works. Cool. All right. Cass Wills Prize. If you're thinking of going to grad school or professional school and graduating this year, you should apply for this $500 scholarship. Do it. Let me know if you have questions. Secondly, if you're attending like a field course this summer or beyond, you can have, there's departmental funds available for you. Definitely check that out. It's worth it. So here's what we're going to do with our performance data analysis. I'm going to jump into this. We're going to walk through your hypotheses and predictions of our in-class experiment with the wall lizards. And we're going to then work through some analyses to determine if the data support your hypotheses and your predictions. And then you're going to write about whether or not the data supported your predictions, hypotheses, predictions, in complete sentences. And you're going to finally follow the link that's been in your class program for the 3rd time now and write a reflection on that. So this is how we're going to start things off. I'm going to open up some R code here. I'm going to walk through the R coding. Now, my expectation is not that you are going to have all of this syntax memorized or anything like that. Rather, I want to walk you through and make sure you understand the big ideas of what we're doing and just get a little bit of exposure to it. Now, I'm aware that for some of you, this is going to be a bit of review, that you've done a lot of R coding before. For some of you, I'm aware that this is going to be brand new. And so I'm going to just kind of accommodate everybody and just walk through everything. And I should upload this code and share it with you if you want. Let me just grab code that I want here. Okay. So let's do this. And I have some activities built into this as well. How many of you have written code to conduct a t-test in R? Oh, you got, okay, this is going to be a lot of review then. Okay, well, I'm going to work through some concepts then, and we'll just make we'll make it happen. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do here in R is to load a couple libraries. As you know, libraries are like packages of commands that allow you to do certain things. And the two packages I'm going to load here, one is called dplyr, one is called tidyr. These are packages that basically just help you kind of manipulate and organize data. You're going to see me do some of this here. You don't need to worry about it. Like, again, I'm not going to ask you the details of it, but I think it's interesting for you to see exactly how we need to work through these data. The next line of code here clears the memory. And so this, what this will do is actually just erase anything that's in the memory. Now I just opened R, so there's nothing in there, but I always do this before I run code, because I might have run previous code and I might, for example, had a variable of the same name or a data frame of the same name, and that's going to screw me up if I run things again. So I'm always just in the habit of clearing it out. The next step here is we have to get our data into into R, right? And what I have here is some code that if your R file, so the file that I'm working with right now, which is called herp class experiment analysis.r, if that's in the same directory, this will set your working directory to whatever directory this file is in. So you have to tell R what directory you want it to look in, and then you have to input your data. I'm going to do that here. So our data are currently in a CSV file, which is a comma separated values file. It's one that you can open and look at in Excel, for example, but we're going to bring it into R. And so now we have our sprint data is here in R, and I'm going to show you what it looks like. I'm going to double click on it and you can see what it is. There's a column for the date. So we did all of this on the 28th of February, like 200 years ago. The ID is like the name of the lizard. The temperature is whether it was hot or cold. And then here's our sprint data. And notice this is just simply cut and paste sprint data from the software that was measuring sprint speed. And so it's got this weird @ symbol and then a bunch of values separated by commas in milliseconds. So we got to do some, that's going to be a little complicated, right? We can't just like analyze that string of numbers. We have to do some things with it. And I'm going to walk you through that. And our last column here is the snout bent length of the animal. And so it's simply the measurement from the tip of the nose to the cloaca of each animal. And that, of course, is in millimeters. So far, we've just got things up and rolling. We got our data in. Sometimes getting your data into R in a format that you can analyze is probably the hardest part of running your whole analysis, because it can be a pain sometimes. So just be aware of that. In the formatting, the placement of commas and things like that actually makes a pretty important difference when you're doing this kind of stuff. All right, so there we've got it. And then I can check the structure of the data frame here. This str command is something that I use all the time. And what it stands for is structure. And it provides output that looks like this. It says my data frame is 7 observations of 5 variables. That means that it has 7 rows and 5 columns. The first column is the date, which is a string of characters. The second column is the ID, which is characters. Temperature, which is characters right now. Sprint data, which is a string of characters. And then SVL, which is numeric. Now, to analyze anything, we can only analyze stuff that is in, we can only analyze data that are in, it's in numeric format, at least for our for general approach right now. So this sprint data that's in character format, we need to do something with that to get it in the numeric format so we can actually analyze it. And I'm going to walk us through how to do that right now. But let me pause here and see what questions you have or what we've done so far. I should have actually uploaded this in advance of class. I'll upload this R code into Blackboard so you can look at it. Questions? Okay, so what I'm going to do here, and this is, I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, but I just want you to see it. The sprint data are currently strings of values separated by commas. So what we need to do is split these up into separate columns so that we can process it. And so what I've done here is I'm going to separate our sprint data by comma, and I'm going to separate it into new values that I'm going to call null, 0, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and end, corresponding to each of the sensors. So I'll do that. And now I'll look at the sprint data. And now I have, oops, let me pull this up. Now, instead of just that one column that just sprint data, now I have I've split that up into a number of columns. This null column just contains characters. This is basically all those @ symbols. So what I did there was just create a column that's just for those @ symbols, and I called it null because I don't care about it. I just want to get rid of those @ symbols. They're just a product of the way the software that records the infrared sensors records data. Next, you see 0. These are all 0. So this is the first sensor being tripped. Excuse me. Yeah, this is the very first sensor being tripped. The first column refers to the time it took the lizard to get to the next sensor. And this time, these units are in milliseconds. So in other words, 1,000 of these are 1 second. So it took this first animal, it took him 0.8 of a second to get from tripping that first sensor to tripping the next sensor. Then this is the time that the animal tripped the next sensor, the next sensor, the next sensor, the next sensor, and so on. And you can see that they're increasing because obviously all of these are the time from 0 that it took to trip that sensor. So obviously they're going to be in an ascending order because you can't trip the next one before you trip the one before it. And so all I've done is just separate all out those commas so I can get this data in a format that we can analyze. I mentioned that we need to have things in numeric, as being read into R as numeric in order to analyze them. And so what I have here is just a bunch of code to take you to the columns and tell it those aren't characters anymore, treat them like numbers. And so I can do that. And now I have a whole bunch of numbers. Sound good so far? All right, now we have all of these numbers. These numbers represent the time that it took the animal to get to each point. But what we don't have is the actual time between each 25-centimeter interval. So we didn't use the time between the 0 and the first interval because we tripped that by hand and then we put the lizard in, right? And so what I have here is I've actually done just some very simple math to calculate the time it took the lizard to travel through these six 25-centimeter intervals. And each interval time is simply the amount of time it took it from at the time at which it passed the second sensor minus the time that it passed the sensor before that. So just the difference between the values of the two consecutive sensors. So the first interval is the second minus the first. The second interval is the third minus the second. The third interval is the fourth minus the third, and so on, all the way up to the seventh sensor minus the sixth. So all of this creates now is instead of these values representing the time that the lizard crossed this, we don't really care what those times are. What we care is the difference between those times, how much time it took to move across that 25-centimeter interval. So we do that, we can get our sprint data now looks like this. Now we have these interval values, and so this tells us how long it took to travel each of those 25-centimeter intervals. Ethan, go ahead.
Why aren't you using the interval from the initial start to sensor one?
Because when we ran the experiment, we put the lizard after the first sensor, right, Princeton? When we did that, didn't we do that?
So,
Did we started it from the beginning?
yeah, I'm pretty sure we just started behind the first.
We start behind the first one? Okay. Okay, so the reason, the more logistical reason is that because of the way this racetrack is set up, the first interval is 50 centimeters rather than 25. And since we want to select the fastest 25-centimeter interval, I just dropped it just to not deal with it, basically. We could use that. So in the work that Princeton presented earlier in class, we actually extracted the fastest 50-centimeter interval a lizard ran, which is a little more complicated math-wise. But for this purposes, I just did 25-centimeter intervals. And since that first interval is longer, I'm just dropping it all together. Yep, that's a good question, though, because you could use that. You could make use of those data. So for our little practice experiment, we're just going to ditch it. It's easier. Yep. I thought we did. Oh, no, maybe I'm thinking of the climbing. Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. Cool. Good question. Other questions? Okay. Now we have all of these intervals. We have 6 different 25-centimeter intervals. What we want to do is pick the fastest one. And that is simply a command called pmin that takes a bunch of values and picks out the smallest one. And so I'm creating a new column here called fastest interval. Now, remember when you see something that looks like this, some text and then a $sign and then more text, this first part of the text refers to our data frame. So we're working with a data frame called sprint data. And then for whatever reason, they decided that between the name of the data frame and the name of the column, they wanted to use a $sign. I don't know. And now I'm making this new column called fastest interval. And I'm saying this fastest interval is going to be whatever value is the smallest of all of these other intervals, right? And that way I can do that. And because remember that those intervals are the time in milliseconds. So the smallest interval, the one with the smallest value, represents the least amount of time, which means that the lizard moved the fastest. We have this fastest interval in milliseconds, but we don't really commonly think of things in milliseconds per 25 centimeters. It's just not intuitive units. So I'm going to do some simple math and convert this to meters per second. So first, I'm going to create a column called fastest time per meter. So I'm taking this fastest interval, the fastest time over which it ran 25 centimeters, and I'm multiplying it by 4. Why am I multiplying this by 4? Bless you. To convert it, yeah, but why 4? Hold on, hands up, please. Somebody, why am I multiplying that time by 4? Why not by 7? Ethan.
Because it's 25. It's multiplied by 4 to get 100, which then gives you 100 centimeters, gives you a meter.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I'm just simply converting it. It's the time it took the animal to run 25 centimeters, but I want to convert that to meters. So 25 centimeters times 4 equals 1 meter. So I do that here first. Then I divide it by 1,000. And that is because our units are currently in milliseconds, and I'm just converting that to seconds. And there's 1,000 milliseconds in a second. And then finally, I'm inverting it. So now this second line of code here calculates the fastest time per meter per second. And so that is the amount of time over which an animal can run 1 meter in seconds. But what I want is not the amount of time that it takes to traverse a meter, but how many meters it can take to go a second. To get that, I simply invert this. So 1 divided by that value. And now I have a column that's fastest speed, and it's in meters per second. And you can see what that looks like right here. Those are values in meters per second. And I can check those and say, okay, I know generally what lizards run. I have some data from previous experiments. Are these right? Are these in the general ballpark of what I expect? They're not like 100 meters per second, which is obviously super fast, or super slow. And yet they're right in the area where I would expect them. So now we've got our column. This is the column of data that we want to analyze. And I can visualize these data by using this histogram function and create a histogram. Oops, I need to make my window a little bigger here. I can create a histogram of our values. You know me, I love my histograms. Now, normally we might expect this to be a kind of normal distribution. The problem here is that we have so few animals that we just don't see that distribution take shape because we just don't have that many data points. But in general, this shows me the range of data that we have for our sprint speed in meters per second. I'm going to pause here now. I want to have you all go back to your hypotheses for this experiment. And specifically, your hypothesis is, do you expect lizards, your prediction do you expect lizards to run faster when it's hotter or colder? And what I'd like you to do right now is to take a second and to draw a box plot of what you think those values look like. So I want you to draw something that looks like this. Let me erase this. Yep. What's that? You will submit an image of your drawing with your reflection on the data analysis. So what we're doing here is our dependent variable is what? Yep. How fast the lizard's running in meters per second. Our independent variable here is temperature. And in this case, it is a discrete it's categorical, right? We don't have continuous value for temperature. In other experiments, you might, let's say we ran the lizards at like 10 different temperatures, then we'd have a continuous predictor. In this case, we're just calling it hot or cold. And we can visualize what these data will look like by making some box plots. And so I'm going to put on my y-axis, I'm going to label it sprint speed, meters per second. And if your axes are not labeled on your diagram, I'm just going to give you a 0 for the entire course. And I'll go home crying. Please always label your axes. They have to be labeled. If they're not labeled, they're completely meaningless. So your x-axis here is just two categories, hot and cold. Your y-axis here says sprint speed and meters per second. Ideally, you're going to have the units on there too. A box plot is simply something where you have a line that represents kind of the mean value. And then you have a box. If you want to get really technical, you can have these whiskers on it that show you the interquartile range for your data. So basically you have a line that represents the mean or median value of your data, and then you kind of showing what the distribution looks like. So in the case that I drew here, there's no difference between hot and cold. They're the same. There's no difference in their mean, nor is there any difference in their variance in the spread of the data. You could have something that looks like this, where cold lizards are running a lot slower, and there's a lot less variance. In other words, this mean is lower than the mean for hot, and at the same time, that range of data is compressed. You could have vice versa. You could have any combination thereof. So what I want you to do now is draw out your hypothesis. Did you expect lizards to be running faster when they're hot or cold? And what is that going to look like in terms of your data? I know I'm doing this a little bit quick and dirty with these box plots. There's a lot more we could get into in explaining how they represent the distribution of your data. But for now, I just want you to kind of visualize what those two categories will look like. So take a second and do that. I can come around and just see how things are going. Make sure you got some sensible look at diagrams. Oh, that's cool. Make sure your axes are labeled. Is that helpful as you're drawing? Okay, let's see lights out for a second. Actually, I can see the screen pretty good. That's good. So it's not, I'm going to show you what this actually looks like with the data for now. Just a second. First, I want you to show me what the data looks like. Your prediction. Yes, just predict these based on what's the only other? Okay, I'm seeing most of you have your box plots drawn. Now what I want to do is actually look at what the differences were. Now I want to just present all of this with the caveat that we have a super small data set right here. Our N is what, 7 or something like that, or whatever it was for the experiment. So take everything with a grain of salt. Like, we don't have the statistical power to really get at differences. What this can do is point the way for future experiments, but we can't really make a ton of inferences on lizard performance based on this very, very limited data set. Nevertheless, we can kind of see what our data look like. So let's go ahead. I'm going to skip down here first and create a box plot to show you what the data look like. And if you see here, the box plot here does cool first. So yours probably has hot here on the left. This one has cool, so just note they're switched. You can see the visualization of the data here. All of the lizards in the cold group ran pretty slow, between 0.4 and 0.6 meters per second or so. All of the lizards in the hot group ran pretty hot, over 1.2 meters per second, with the exception of this dude. He was in the hot group. Who the hell knows what he was doing? He wasn't running. He had a bad day, right? And that's normal. That's a biological experiment, right? Everything looks great except for this one lizard that screws it up. But that's the reality of doing an experiment with these guys. But you can see pretty dang clear differences here between the groups. And what's important too to think about the magnitude of these differences. Not only are these values a lot higher, they're more than twice as high. So they're running twice as fast when they're hot as when they're cool. Now, to test that, we are going to use a statistical test called a t-test. A t-test is simply a test where, actually, would you mind writing this on the board, Princeton? T-test tests for differences between two categories. Do you need a better chalk? Is that one's kind of crummy, isn't it? Yeah. Here, use this one. So a t-test will give you a basic statistical test for differences between values in two categories. And it has to be exactly two categories. There's other tests, of course, you could do when there's more categories, but a t-test is only two categories. And so I'm going to run that on R here, and that's going to give us some output. And it gives us a whole bunch of information here with a t-test. Now, what we're really interested in is this differences in the means of the cool group and the hot group. And you can see that in the cool group, the average value was just under 0.5 meters per second. In the hot group, the average value was 1.5 meters, or excuse me, 1.125 meters per second, approximately. So the hot group is running on average about twice as fast or more than lizards in the cool group. And if we compare this with the statistical test, we get a p-value of 0.001935, which we can interpret as being statistically significant generally. Now, there is no absolute concrete p-value that describes what a significant result is. Almost everything that you're going to encounter will use the value of 0.05 as a cutoff. But I really want to emphasize that that is completely arbitrary. In fact, it comes from back in the day when they were first developing these statistical methods about 100 years ago. A guy named R.A. Fisher, who was a statistical genius, but also kind of a racist asshole, complicated figure, right? Somebody asked him, like, well, you're making these statistical tests. What do you think represents like a significant result? And he was like, oh, I don't know, 1 in 20. So 1 in 20 is 5%, right? 0.05. And that's basically stuck since then. And it's become a value that is useful, but also kind of overused. And that's a whole different story for statistics class. The takeaway message here is that our p-value is 0.0019. And so that's very, very low, lower than 0.05 by a lot. And so I would based on these differences in means, and based on our visualization of our data, all of that points to the fact that lizards are in fact running much faster when it's hotter compared to when it's cooler. There's a lot more I can unpack with the p-value and what it actually means. In general, I want you to think of the p-value of the chance of these differences between these two groups, the chances of those differences happening by pure chance, by random draw. You just happen to pick a bunch of fast lizards in the hot group and a bunch of fast lizards in the cool group. That's totally possible biologically, right? But what we're looking at here, assuming that we picked our lizards in our groups randomly, is that there's a 0.0019 chance of that happening at random. So less than 0.1% of the time will these results be produced just by chance. And so what that means is that we can reject what's called the null hypothesis, and we can say with some confidence that these results are not produced by chance, but rather they're produced by the biological effect of temperature on a lizard's sprinting performance. Takeaway, important messages to take away. 1, I want to make sure you know what a box plot is and how you visualize data with it. 2, I want you to understand that a t-test, it's funny, I'm looking at my cursor and I tried to put my cursor off to the side to highlight what Princeton wrote on the board there, but that doesn't work. A t-test tests for categorical, tests for differences between numbers or between values that are in two categories, exactly two categories. And also, I just want you to see that very often I see, especially when students run statistical tests, they'll run a t-test and they'll just look at this p-value and ignore everything else. But really, I think the most important thing to see here is these means between the two groups and how very different they are. You also get a confidence interval for the difference between the two groups. And you can see that the confidence interval extends from negative 1.1 to negative 0.4. And you'll notice that that confidence interval excludes 0. So all of the values within that confidence interval are outside of 0, which means that there is a difference between these two groups, because this represents the difference in values between lizards in the hot and lizards in the cool. In this case, it's cool minus hot, which is why it's negative. But the important thing is that it doesn't include 0. There's your t-test. That's how we compare that. Very robust support, despite the small sample size, for lizards running faster when it's hotter compared to when it's cool. So that's neat, right? Get to see a biological effect in action. You just confirmed a longstanding hypothesis about lizard sprinting performance. Cool. Questions? All right. I'm going to go ahead then and let's look at our second set of predictions. Then that was about the relationships between body size and sprint speed. And for that, can I get that piece of that sweet? There's only one good piece of chalk. With this, we're going to draw what's called a scatter plot. I'm going to draw my X and Y axes again. Actually, if I was smart, I would have just left the Y axis as sprint speed. Remember, the Y axis is almost always your dependent variable. And the x-axis is your independent variable. So what's our x-axis on this scatter plot for the relationship between body size and sprint speed? What's on our x-axis? Body size and SVL. Yep. And I'm just going to put SVL. We know what that abbreviation is, and that is in millimeters. We're not putting any specific numbers on this, so it doesn't matter that much, but there you go. Now, a scatter plot describes the relationship between two sets of numeric values that are paired, right? In other words, we had a lizard that was really big and he ran this fast. We had another lizard that was a little smaller and he ran this fast. We had another lizard that was a little smaller and he ran this fast, this fast, this fast, and so on. So each point here represents one lizard. On the x-axis is its value for its body size. Bigger lizards over here, smaller lizards down here. The y-axis represents its value for its sprint speed. Slow lizards here, fast lizards here. Now, these example dots I just drew show a kind of trend. If I drew a line through those dots, you'd see something like this. This indicates that as a lizard gets bigger, its sprint speed also increases. Now, of course, we can have a relationship where bigger lizards run slower, in which case it's going to look like that. Or importantly, we can have a relationship that describes no dependency of sprint speed on SVL. In other words, something like this. All lizards, at least across the range of values, regardless of size, they're running about the same speed. Now remember, this line is fit to the average. So it's not that they're running all exactly the same. It's just that if you draw the line of best fit to those points, you're going to get something that's flat. It doesn't have a slope, right? So take a minute and draw your predicted relationship for sprint speed, for snout vent length and sprint speed. Yeah, you can just, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that, McKenna. You can just draw the line of best fit. That's fine. You don't have to draw individual data points. You can if you want to add it. I'm going to put some artistic flair in there. I'm seeing a lot of varying predictions here. Bigger lizards faster, bigger lizards slower. I'm seeing no relationship, which is cool. All right, let's see what our data look like. I'm going to just go ahead and create the plot. Whoa, hey, easy, buddy. Why did I make it so big? Oh, I did a linear model here, huh? Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay. PCH 19. No, that's actually fine. That tells you. I'm just going to adjust the parameters. There we go. All right. So this is what our data look like. Sprint speed on the x-axis, body size on the x-axis, sprint speed on the y-axis. You can see where our values fall. Looking at this visually, there's no obvious relationship. It doesn't look like faster lizards are running slower, in which case we'd expect that a line that kind of moves from the upper left to the lower right, nor does it look like bigger lizards run faster, in which case we'd expect a line that goes from the lower left to the upper right. So visually, I'm really not seeing any relationship there. Now let's test that with a statistical test. And for this, we're going to use something a little more nuanced, something called a linear model. A linear model is what you can use to assess this relationship between two continuous variables. And so Princeton, if you don't mind writing up there, a linear model, or in this case, it's a kind of, the kind of linear model we're using is a linear regression. Actually, we'll call it a linear regression test for the relationship between two continuous variables. In other words, both our x and our y-axis are a set of numbers, right? And so we're going to create that model. Don't worry too much about the syntax here. And then I'm going to ask for the summary of this. And if we look at the summary of this, we can see that this p-value here for snout vent length is 0.5, so very high. We can also see that our r-squared value is 0.06, which is very low. So remember, your r-squared value describes the strength of the relationships between two variables. And in this case, and it ranges from 0 to 1. In this case, it's 0.06, so very, very small. So there's really no support whatsoever for the dependency of sprint speed on body size. Now, thinking about our experiments, going back to biological terms, why, if we're going to report these results, what caveat would we add to this result? Lennon?
Really low data size.
Really small data size? Good. What other caveats would you add to this? Catherine, go ahead. One more time. Actually, hold that thought. We're going to come back to that. Okay. So hold that thought, because you're absolutely right. We're gonna add that too. What other caveat would you add? Yeah.
I guess like it wasn't really controlled. Like it was very, for lack of a better word, it was an experiment. Like there wasn't any necessarily continuous replication as far as like standard, I guess.
Well, we had low sample size.
Well, but like kind of just did it really fast. Like I feel like it wasn't super structured, I guess is the word I'm looking for.
Okay, I'm thinking specifically here, if we wanted to make an inference about the relationship of body size on sprint speed, what other important caveat might we have? Ethan, go ahead. We did it over 1 day. Sure, we didn't do repeated measures, but again, specifically, I'm trying to pull out one important caveat here. I have one thing in mind. This is terrible teaching pedagogy, by the way. When you have a specific answer in mind, you ask an open-ended question just to be transparent. But there is one important thing I want to make sure you get. Let's try this in. So they were all males. Good. So that's one caveat, is that we only tested males, so we can't say anything about snout vent length with females. What other characteristics of the animals would limit our inference? Yep, Carissa? Okay, if there were differences in size. Now let's assume that there was no difference. Let's assume we did a nice randomization, but if there were differences, that would be important. What other characteristics of the lizards might limit our inference? Yeah, we only had adult lizards, right? And so if you wanted to make a statement about the dependence of sprint speed on size, you would need to get all age classes from your small little babies to your big animals. So the fact that we only measured this in adult males limits how much we can say about the dependency of sprint speed on lizards generally. That combined, of course, with the fact that it was a haphazard experiment we did in class and we have a very small sample size. But I think it's important. We want to make sure when you're thinking about our experimental results, we're not overstating things and saying all lizards, no lizards exhibit a dependency of sprint speed on snout vent length. Well, in a very small subset of adult male Podarcis moralis kept in captivity, that's true, but you can't really make generalizations outside of that. Athena, go ahead. We just did snout vent length. Yeah, because you could have animals of the same size that have more or less body mass. And that gets into something called body condition. That's often used, especially in experiments with snakes and lizards. It's a scaled version of your body mass. So it's how big you are relative to your length. Now, the problem with that is that without getting into more detail, you don't really know if that extra mass is due to fat or muscle or whatever kind of body tissue. Or if it's a female, it could be a gravid female with lots of eggs or something like that. You can end up, so yeah, but that's super important too. Good. Now we have our linear model here. We can look at the residuals of our model, make sure they look, more or less normally distributed. I don't think they do because of our low sample size. Yeah. So ideally we'd want the residuals of our model, so the values left over after we create our linear regression to be more bell-shaped here. They're not really, but I'm not too worried about that in our case because it's just small sample sizes. I made the scatter plot already. Now, the last thing I want to do is Catherine mentioned that we not only had animals of different sizes, but we also ran them at different temperatures. So the cool thing about a linear model is we can test for the effects of both snout vent length and temperature in the same model. So this is just called the kind of model. This is called a multiple regression. So when we had just temperature, we call that a linear regression. Now it's a multiple regression because we have multiple dependent variables. And we can also, what's cool is we can do this with things that are continuous, like snout vent length, and we can do this with categorical dependent variables, in this case, temperature. So we can create a model with both temperature and snout vent length, and then we can see what the results are. And perhaps exactly as we expect, we see that there is no effect of snout vent length on sprint speed. But again, an effect, a statistically significant effect, if we want to use 0.05 as our cutoff, of temperature on that sprint speed. So this is a way where we can combine essentially both that t-test and that linear regression in the exact same thing. And we can look at our residuals again. They probably look crappy. Oh, they look better, actually. Now we're kind of getting at residuals the way they should look if we're meeting our assumptions of the normal distribution of residuals. There's lots more you can do with these models. You can test for interactions. You can test for, you can do a variety of, you can add more dependent variables, et cetera, et cetera. But for now, I just wanted to present what our data from our class experiment looked like. Let me get Chase and then.
I thought when you tested for multiple variables, you used to do that.
Ah, okay, great. So what this linear model does, how do I want to say this? Okay, if I do this linear model with just, I'm going to take this same model and I'm going to run it with just temperature, right? So now I just have this single categorical dependent variable, right? I run that. Oops, actually, I want to call this something else. And I look at this. Now, what I've just done is a t-test. It's the same thing as a t-test where I have just one dependent variable. In this case, it's a categorical variable. Now, this is also the exact same thing as an ANOVA. What ANOVA can do, though, is you can have more than two categories. You can have 3, 4 categories. Let's say that we want to run, I don't know, let's say we have 4 temperature categories. We measure them at 10, 20, 30, and 40 degrees C, and we want to just test that categorically. Then we use something called, that would be a one-way ANOVA, where we're just testing for the effect of that one thing on the dependent variable. Yep, so that would be the next step. Now, what's cool is this linear model, it does all the things. It's essentially is a way to conduct the same test that you would do with a t-test or an ANOVA, and you can combine them as well. Yep, I'm glad you said that because I wanted to make that connection. ANOVA, just to actually, you don't mind, Princeton, ANOVA is short for analysis of variance. And it's a way to compare differences when you have more than 2 groups. So a t-test is 2 groups. If you have 3, 4, or more groups, you use an ANOVA. Thanks, Chase. Thanks for bringing that up. Nebraska.
Can we go back to the first scatter plot that you showed us?
Yeah. This one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then my question is, how do we, because like in my head, maybe I just really want to right. But I see that it's like a negative regression with the exception of very last point.
Uh-huh.
Like it looks kind of negative
Uh-huh.
to me.
Uh-huh.
So how do we know that like we can't just say that the 70 is wrong?
So you think that this might be an outlier that's
I
screwing
think
things up?
that's an outlier and I think that I'm right.
Okay, let's test it. And that's actually really straightforward to test. Let me go here. And I'm going to do this down here. And what I'm going to do is where I say data, I'm going to tell it to use data, use sprint data. This is getting into a little syntax you don't need to worry about, where sprint data $SVL is less than 68. Right? And so now I'm going to use our same data frame and do the same test. I'm going to say if the cell vent length of a lizard is above 68, get rid of it, okay? So now we're going to run that. We'll get the same model result and see what we get. Now we have an almost significant negative relationship. So I'd say you're exactly right, that except for this big fast guy, if we pull him out, then we do have what's trending towards a negative relationship here. So if I was analyzing, actually, this just came up recently. I'm really glad you said that. And some data that we're analyzing where we had like one value that was just totally whack-a-madoodle and kind of screwing everything up. And we had to decide, is that real? Like, did we make a mistake doing the experiment? Did we mismeasure the snout vent length? Did we mismeasure the speed? If we screwed up, then we want to pull that value out because it's messing up our results. But if we have no reason to think that, then basically what we need is a larger sample size so we can have more data points so that one data point doesn't pull the mean so far out. That's really astute. I'm glad you said that. Good. Yeah.
So adding on to that, could we even consider those results to be statistically significant? Because in this particular test, there's a chance that temperature could be a confounding factor because they were tested at different times.
Right. So, well, what you'd want to do for that. All right. So now you want to get into it is let's go ahead here, go back to our linear model with both snout vent length and temperature and get rid of that one dork from that one. And now you see nothing is significant. So if we get rid of this one outlier value and then simultaneously test for the effect of temperature and snout vent length, we find nothing. So now all of a sudden temperature is not even important. So where does that leave us? With a larger sample size, those kind of troubles go away because one outlier is not going to pull your mean so far. But you can see where it becomes really important to consider that one data point, right? Because that can change our interpretation of snout vent length and it can change our interpretation of temperature. Good. I'm actually really glad that worked out that way. This is an awesome discussion. Okay. That is the eternal question. What is considered large enough? So Princeton experiment from last summer, we measured sprint speed in lizards and we had an N of 29. Is that right? And same for this year too, which is not a huge N, but what's important about that experiment is we measured each individual like 10 different times for 10 different things. And so we had repeated measures so we could kind of show that the differences were not just due to like a random good, bad day with the lizard, but were consistent over time.
So if you did like trials,
It would make it better in the sense that you could estimate how consistent each animal is in its sprinting, but it still might not really capture differences between like hot and cold lizards or something like that. Although having said that, in our experiment, there's such clear differences anyway. Let's say those differences weren't as clear, then you might not get it. And so it's a real trade-off in experimental design. Do you measure a whole bunch of animals one time each? Or do you measure, like, do I measure 80 lizards once each? Or do I measure 20 lizards each 4 times? And what it really is dependent on what question you're asking, what you want to know about, in this case, lizard performance. And that's going to change how you approach those experiments. Ideally, bigger sample size are always better. It's just a matter of being able to do it logistically. And we started off, for example, Princeton, our goal was to do, I think, 40 lizards or something like that with the experiment. And over time, the lizards dropped their tail during the middle of the experiment, or other things happened that precluded us from including them. So our sample size was reduced, but still respectable, I like to think. Would you agree, Princeton? Yeah, very respectable. Chase, good.
So if you're measuring out, but what does it matter if they drop their tail? Is it because they're using more energy to revert back and not sprint speed?
Right, and that's it really affects their sprint speed. So in the middle of we were measuring sprint speed with lizards, and we ran, let's say we're doing 10 trials total with an animal. Somewhere after its 5th trial, it drops its tail. Well, now it has a different mass. It has a different ability to move quickly in a straight line. And tails in lizards, importantly, help them maneuver. And so all of the values after it drops its tail are not going to be comparable to before its tail. So we basically have to just lose all the data for the whole animal.
So if its tail has a lot of impact, did you also measure that?
And yep, we sure did. And we only used animals with like full intact tails.
So then does their tail length have an impact on their sprint speed?
We should test it.
Or their ability, I guess, to be better?
They absolutely could. Yeah. I don't know the answer. I would guess that the answer is yes. But I can't think of a paper off the top of my head that's looked at like the tail across a range of areas. They've done experiments where they had animals with full tails and animals that lost their tails. I'm sure there are. I just can't tell you exactly off the top of my head. Do you know any of that off the top of your head? Yeah. So yeah, that's great. You're probably right. And maybe we should have measured tail length to see if it affected maneuverability last year. Where was Chase?
I think we did do that for a different reason.
Yeah.
Because the historical specimens.
Oh, that's
had no
right.
tails.
That's true. That's true. That's true. Yeah. That's a good point too. Yeah, and all these points that everyone's bringing up, like these are the difficult considerations you got to do when you're designing an experiment, and there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer. The only right answer is what you can convince reviewers of your manuscript is acceptable to publish. So cool. Great discussion. Appreciate everyone's interest in this. The video will be up. I will upload the code and the data to Blackboard for you, so you can take a look at this in more detail if you like. What I'm really interested in you taking away here is this big ideas about how we test hypotheses and what the visualization of data look like when we're either supporting or not supporting certain hypotheses. So I'm going to save this and I'm going to go back to here and let's take a 5-minute stretch break and we'll come back. I'm going to talk about snakes a little bit. We'll do your quiz. We're just on schedule. All right, let's get back to it here. So as I said, I've got a short lecture on snakes, and then we're going to move into our frog call quiz. Will, can I ask you to get the lights again, please? And thank you. All right, so I want to go over 3 species of snake that are common in Ohio and that we may encounter with our outings. All 3 of these species are in the family Colubridae, and they're in the subfamily Natracinae. So remember, Colubridae is this really big family of snakes, includes venomous and non-venomous snakes. But this subfamily Natracinae includes some very common and non-venomous and conspicuous snakes here in North America, including garter snakes, water snakes, the northern brown snake, which we covered last week, or Monday rather, or last week. As well as queen snakes. The first I want to talk about is the common garter snake. This guy has a super broad geographic range across much of northern the US and up into Canada. This is the species where sometimes you see those pictures of like snake dens with tens of thousands of snakes. That's these guys up in Canada. Pretty cool phenomena. We'll see if we can talk about that a little later in class. They have this kind of dark green or black background, and they have 3 stripes that extend from behind their head and then on either side. What's cool is you can see in this guy some flecks of red. This guy is in a very defensive posture. I kind of pissed him off. And when they do that, they kind of flatten their bodies, which extends the space between their scales and exposes that red. Under normal circumstances, you wouldn't really see any of that red or very little of it. But when they're frightened, they'll get in this defensive posture where they flatten themselves, extend their skin, and you can see the red. It's pretty neat. In some cases, you can't see that when they're just not under this kind of frightened circumstances. But a lot of times it really comes out when they're dorsolaterally flattened. Their scale on the lateral side is on the second and third scale row. Not terribly important information for you right now. It's a way to distinguish them from some other garter snake species, but I'm not comparing them right now. They do have these keeled scales and an undivided anal plate. Again, useful for comparing to other species, but for us right now, we don't need to worry too much about those details. What's cool about these guys, and in fact, most snakes in Natracine, or many snakes in Natracine, but not all, is they give live birth. So these guys will give birth in July, August, around here, and they can give birth up to 20, 30 babies at a time. It's pretty cool. The babies are alive. They come out in this little like sack and they break out of it, and then they're just adorable and cute. And then they get eaten by birds in their first week of life. So these guys, you can see an example here of a snake again in a defensive posture. You can see how kind of clearly delineated this dorsal stripe is. It's this really bright yellow on a black background. And you can see some of the red coming out here where he's extending his hand, or his mouth, trying to bite. Is that me? That might be me, actually. I think I took that picture, yeah. I want to point out, just as a quick aside, this dorsal stripe is really conspicuous. And what's really cool about it is that it serves as an optical illusion. When you see a snake moving in grasses or on any substrate, really, what that vertical line does is it tricks your eye into not knowing exactly where the snake is in space. It makes it really hard to track the animal, and it fools predators. Anyone that's tried to catch a snake that's moving knows that you kind of think the snake is here, but it's really 2 feet in front of you. And it serves as this kind of neat optical illusion that helps protect it from predators. Mm-hmm. No, I'm not. No, I'm not going to get into any of that. I don't like subspecies. I don't believe in subspecies. Yeah, that's a controversial statement, but we're not covering subspecies. Yeah, yeah, that's not entirely true, but it's kind of mostly true. What happened to answer? So a lot of times, a lot of these groups are broken into subspecies based on morphological variation across their geography, and they're thought of as different subspecies. But then later, in more recent years, when people did the molecular work to see how they're actually evolutionary related, looking at DNA sequences, that doesn't hold up. It doesn't hold out. And so for us anyway, it's not much value in talking about subspecies here. Yeah, that's why I'm not going to talk about it. These guys are also famous. I'm talking about the color patterns for variation in their color patterns. These and other garter snake species have been really well studied because of variation in their color. This is a great example. These are actually 3 snakes I found together under the same rock one very lucky day in August 2013 back in Western New York, where I grew up. And you can see that even under the same rock in the same population, they exhibit great variation in their color patterns. Second species I want to talk about is the northern water snake, Nerodia cipodon. Again, same family, Colubridae, same subfamily, Natracinae. These are nasty buggers. You got to love them. Water snakes, garter snakes, when you catch them, they will try to bite you, as you can see here. They'll also release their urates, which is basically their solid urine, and their poop on you. They can be pretty feisty, but that can vary a lot. Water snakes are a force of nature to be reckoned with. These guys will try to eat you. They bite, and they're non-venomous, but they get pretty large and they can inflict a nasty bite. I don't like getting bitten by them. They also are really stinky. A lot of them specialize on fish. So their poop smells really kind of fishy and gross. Like you get it on your hands smell like garter snake or water snake for like 3 days. It's pretty gnarly, but it's pretty effective anti-predator mechanism. They have this banded coloration where they have these dark bands and light bands, but importantly, notice that the dark bands are wider than the lighter bands. And also notice that the pattern doesn't really, sometimes when they're on land, it looks like just a uniform color when they're dry, but when they get in water, these bands really kind of stand out. And that banding continues right down to the tail. Their venter, their belly, is very uniquely colored as well and has often white, but it has these kind of brown and red half moon patterns. And I want to show you what that looks like here. So here's the belly of a snake. This is one that I caught as well. This guy has this extremely like red and black kind of, actually looks like a bunch of histograms of data. It's not, it would be cool if it was, but these really kind of unique belly patterns. I love looking at their bellies, and it varies a lot, but it's generally white with these red or black kind of half moon patterns on it. They too have strongly keeled scales, but contrary to garter snakes, they have a divided anal plate. Again, these details I don't need you to worry about in too much detail. If we talk about other garter snake species and how to distinguish them, we might get into that kind of stuff. But for now, I just want to present a little bit of the general natural history. Remember that we showed this slide earlier in class, comparing the Nerotius hippodon, the northern water snake, to the copperhead and Chistrodon contortrix. Notice some important differences here in the shape of the head. Although I will say that water snakes, when they're pissed, they'll pull their heads back and make it look very triangular. Not the scientific term to call them pissed, but you know what I mean. They can mimic these guys pretty well. Notice that the copperhead has these kind of hourglass patterns in its banding, whereas the water snake has these kind of offset dark and light bands between its back and its sides. Of course, water snakes don't have heat pits like the copperhead does, and they have much more strongly keeled scales, although you're probably not going to get close enough to compare that and be like, oh, does this have strongly keeled or weakly keeled scales? I don't know. Don't do that. Use these other characteristics. So just a little refresher. We talked about that early in the semester, just to remind you that you can tell the difference between water snakes and copperheads pretty readily. Final snake I want to talk about. Sid, go ahead. Oh yeah, you know, that's a piece of natural history that I regret that I didn't include on these slides. I should add it. They can get, I mean, snout to vent length, you get some females out here, they can be this big, and then they've got their tail is another bit. I mean, you can get snakes that are I think the biggest one we've caught here is maybe like 700 millimeters snout vent length, so like that big. They get pretty big too. They get pretty robust compared to a garter. Snakes tend to be long and skinnier. These guys can be pretty wide and bulky. And they yeah, they're just formidable beasts, I would say. They're kind of some of my favorite in this reptile world. They're great. The last one I want to talk about is Regina septemvittata, the queen snake. These guys you can find along the Delaware Run here. One of my first weeks here, I spotted one, and I was super excited because I'd never seen a queen snake before in the wild in my life, which is cool. Again, same subfamily, Natricinae. These guys have a unique color pattern. Their dorsum, their back, is generally like this kind of light brown color, but then they have these unique stripes down. There's like lighter colored stripes down their side. And you can also see some faint black stripes in there as well. Their belly, their venter, also has this kind of cool line pattern, these stripes along the center of the venter. And very distinguished stripes there. They're strongly sexually dimorphic. I guess so are water snakes for that matter, whereas the females are much bigger than the males. And this is tied to the fact that they give live birth. The females, the bigger the female, the more babies she can carry, and the greater her reproductive fitness. These guys generally will live along moving water. So I'll go back for a second. Water snakes tend to live they'll live near streams, rivers, ponds, lakes, etc., etc. There's actually a quite famous subspecies of these guys, and subspecies I know that live on a specific island up in Lake Erie. Your queen snakes generally, however, will only live along moving water, and that is because they are crayfish specialists. Their diet and it is often entirely composed of crayfish. I'm going to show you a short video here in a second. I do want to show you the color pattern of the venter and the dorsum combined here. You can see a nice queen snake photo. You can see this stripe, and you can see how these stripes extend down the venter, although they're kind of broken up into kind of blotches as you get closer to the vent. Really beautiful snakes. They tend to bask up in branches around bodies of water too, and tend to be longer and more slender than water snakes. So generally speaking, but not always, you're more likely to find water snakes on the ground or under rocks, whereas these guys, you're more likely to find kind of moving around up in tree branches and things like that even. Question, Ethan.
Can I possibly make a note about seeing them on campus?
Say again?
Can I make a note if you want to see them on campus?
We're going to along the run?
Well, I mean, like if they're on their own and they want to see them out and about.
Sure.
If you go over to where the art building is and like over near the bridge,
Yeah.
you stand on the
Oh, yeah,
bridge,
yeah.
the water is super clear right there. There's a ton of rocks and you can see the queen snakes underneath the water sometimes. They'll be hunting the different crayfish. You see them going from like rock to rock searching for them.
Yeah, you can, yeah, it's actually really cool to look up on the bridge. You see water snakes swimming around and queen
Yeah.
snakes. If you sit down like along the bank of that on a good day for half an hour, you'll see a bunch of snakes. So. All right, I want to wrap things up. I want to show you a short video. I mentioned these guys are crayfish specialists. I want to show you a video of what that looks like. Did I see a hand over here?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask how big they are.
They are, I wish I had some, I should have put the actual measurements up here. They're smaller than water snakes, but they can still get fairly long. You can still get snout vent length like this or so.
Not nearly as many, but sufficient. States, many of them great. They have a hard shell, and they have particularly powerful noses as well. Queens, these nothing else. Just any.
I love watching these guys swim. They're so cool.
Every 3 to 4 weeks, a split appears across the back of the shell. The old shell hinges away, and the crayfish pulls itself out, and it stands its body, which is soft. Now, the snake has its chance. The new molted crayfish looks much the same, but it gives off different chemicals that the snake can detect in the water it's done, and from some distance away. Can swallow this one, because since it's newly molted, it's as soft as a boiled egg.
It's kind of awesome, actually. It's a giant crayfish compared to the size of that snake.
It just eats a lot, doesn't it?
Yep. It's actually really unusual for snakes to eat prey tail first rather than head first too. But because crayfish move backwards, all of their limbs kind of fold forward rather than back. They'll eat the crayfish backwards. Awesome, queen snakes, something you can see right down at our own Delaware run. All right, so with that, I have a few announcements, and then we're going to do our quiz. Remember, save the dates. Actually, Will, would you mind grabbing the lights for me? SK, let me just do a couple announcements so I get your question. Save the date. We're going to see mud puppies again 2 weeks from today. I'll give you more details as we get closer, but make sure, especially if you want to go on the evening trip, you've got that time available. Otherwise, I have a marginally funny comic for you and a few other reminders. Oh, wait, this is okay. All right, I fixed this for you. The revision is due Monday, 11th of April. I apologize for any lack of clarity about that. I just changed my mind at it, but it is Monday. There you go. I have open hours Monday as well. And I want to remind you that next week, the weather is actually looking promising. We will head down to the Delaware Run to look for queen snakes and water snakes, potentially even both Monday and Wednesday next week. I think Dr. Carino might actually come with us on Monday too. So please be, that's a good reaction. Please be prepared to go out, just, walking over to the Delaware Run. So when I say be prepared, I just be prepared to be outside, protect yourself from the sun, and have suitable footwear to walk around, at least like on the grass and stuff like that. You don't have to go traipsing through the creek or anything like that, but be prepared to go outside Monday and Wednesday next week. SK had a question. How do they move underwater? Oh, breathe. They don't. They can hold their breath for a while. And so they can do all of that while holding their breath, which is really cool. I'm glad you asked that. To be outside. I don't know yet. It's going to depend on the weather and a few other things. So it'll be part to hopefully most of class, I would say. We might still do a few things. When we're going to meet here. Yeah. Oh, to be clear, thanks for asking, Chase. Monday, Wednesday, we will meet in this room. We may spend the majority of class outside, but we're still going to meet here, get our stuff together. I might show you some of the equipment because hopefully we'll be not only catching snakes, but we might be collecting some blood samples and stuff like that. I want to show you all those techniques. I'm pretty rusty. I haven't collected a blood sample from a snake in a while, but at one time in my life, I was one of the world's best snake bleeders. I like to think I was good. I was real good. I've lost a little bit of skills. That's a good example of a non-transferable skill. Like you go into a different job market and you say you can really quickly draw blood from the caudal vein of a snake. Doesn't get you very far. Any other questions before we transition to your quiz? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording of the video here.